Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I want to talk about this case that I became aware of right before Johnny's libel verdict came out, so I couldn't talk about it for this last month. But now that things have slowed down and we're waiting for further updates from Johnny's appeal, I can finally talk about this case. It's very recent, it only happened this year, and it involves a man by the name of James Fairbanks. So as with my other videos in the Beyond a Reasonable Doubt series, we're going to look at the facts of the case and then examine the charges that have been made against the defendant and ascertain whether they are indeed guilty or not. But what makes this case unique is the fact that it hasn't gone to trial yet. So we will have the advantage, I suppose, of arriving at our own decisions without being influenced by the decision of the jury or the judge. So Mr. Fairbanks is a 43-year-old who lived in North Omaha. He had found an apartment on Pinckney Street, which is the same street that 64-year-old Matteo Condellucci lived in. It turns out that Condellucci was actually a registered sex offender who was convicted of sex crimes twice. Once in Florida in 1994 and a second time in Sarpy County in 2007. There are others that have come forward accusing Condellucci of sexually assaulting them as well, but no charges have been made against him with regards to these accusations. Furthermore, it turns out that Condellucci allegedly sexually assaulted his own daughter, who publicly came out in support of the defendant, Mr. James Fairbanks. So because Mr. Fairbanks had a young son who was going to live with him, he looked up the sex offender registry for his area in order to make sure that it was a safe environment for his child to live in. And that's how he came across Matteo Condellucci. When he found out about him, he decided to check things out by himself. So he drove by and saw Condellucci pretending to wash his car with no soap or water, watching kids playing in the driveway of an empty house next door. According to Fairbanks, Condellucci was staring at these children in a way that normal adults wouldn't be. Mr. Fairbanks never called the police, but he did conduct further research of his own accord and came across some more distressing information about Condellucci online. Now, the topic of child molestation or the sexual assault of children is quite a sensitive topic to Mr. Fairbanks, because while he had never been subjected to such ordeals, as a child he witnessed someone close to him experiencing such an ordeal, and he also worked with children who have been through these experiences and witnessed firsthand the lifelong trauma that can affect these children. So Mr. Fairbanks was quite upset that Mr. Condellucci was allowed to live in a neighborhood with children, and he also went as far as setting up a play area in his own backyard to lure these children to his house. As part of Mr. Condellucci's criminal record, a psychologist's report indicated that he was a dangerous sex offender who was substantially unable to control his criminal behavior. According to Mr. Fairbanks, he was tormented for days about Mr. Condellucci's presence in the neighborhood. He said that he thinks that the law doesn't protect kids enough, and so that's why one day he decided to confront Mr. Condellucci. On May 14, Mr. Fairbanks went to Mr. Condellucci's property, and he went there armed with a gun that he purchased weeks earlier. So it's important to keep note of this fact, because he didn't purchase the gun in order to confront Mr. Condellucci. When he purchased the gun, it was before he moved to the neighborhood, because he confronted Mr. Condellucci a mere days after deciding to live on this particular street. So when he purchased the gun, he had no idea Mr. Condellucci existed, and in fact, I believe he lived in an entirely different area, if not a different state altogether. When Mr. Fairbanks confronted Mr. Condellucci, he threatened him, telling him that he knew exactly who he was, and that if he hurt any of the children, he wasn't going to get away with it. Mr. Fairbanks then states that he pulled out his gun and told Mr. Condellucci to move back. So Mr. Condellucci backed up into his home, but then Mr. Fairbanks paused when he noticed a woman's purse on the couch, which made him wonder if there was someone else at home. Mr. Condalucci then took advantage of this and he rushed at Fairbanks. Now, Mr. Condalucci was more than 6 feet tall and 300 pounds. So he was a big, burly man. Mr. Fairbanks said that he couldn't remember how many shots he fired, but eventually Mr. Condalucci dropped at his feet and he was found dead 2 days later at his home. Mr. Fairbanks said that he didn't know if he had died or not, but he knew that he shot him in the chest. So a few days passed after the shooting and no one was arrested. So after the passage of a number of days, Mr. Fairbanks said that he couldn't live with getting away with what he had done, and so he admitted to fatally shooting Mr. Condalucci and wrote an email admitting to the crime. He sent this email to local news media outlets 4 days after Mr. Condalucci's death. All right, so Mr. Fairbanks was charged with first-degree murder. Let's have a look at the elements of first-degree murder in Nebraska, which is the relevant state, in order to ascertain whether they have been satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt in order to secure a conviction. A person commits murder in the first degree if he or she kills another person purposely and with deliberate and premeditated malice. All right, so this crime can be broken down into the following elements. Number 1 is causation. So the accused's actions have led to or caused the death of the deceased. The second element is purpose. So the killing was done purposely rather than by accident. And the third element is premeditation, which is the most important element because it distinguishes first-degree murder from other types such as second-degree murder. Premeditation is essentially prior planning, and it needn't have occurred significantly before the crime was committed. So it could have been planned a mere few minutes or even seconds before the crime is committed. The term deliberate, used in the statute, means not suddenly, not rashly, and it requires that the defendant considered the probable consequences of their actions before actually committing the act. All right, so Mr. Fairbanks has decided to take this to trial, so he has not pleaded guilty, and as I said earlier, he is claiming self-defense. So his account is that he only pulled the trigger and shot Mr. Condalucci when he rushed at him. And because of his size and, of course, his background and his history as a criminal, Mr. Fairbanks felt threatened and decided to defend himself by discharging the weapon. So in order for the prosecution to successfully convict Mr. Fairbanks of first-degree murder, the jury must be satisfied that all the elements of the crime that we just discussed have been met by the prosecution or proven by the prosecution beyond a reasonable doubt. So the burden of proof rests on the prosecution, not on the defense. And beyond a reasonable doubt, if you haven't watched any of my other videos, is a very high standard. It is the criminal standard of proof, and it essentially means that the jury must have no reasonable doubt in their minds that Mr. Fairbanks committed the crime of first-degree murder. An example of an unreasonable doubt is if the defense was that aliens shot Mr. Condalucci, or he tripped and he shot himself. So something that's unreasonable, something that's far-fetched and difficult to believe. It's also worth noting that Mr. Fairbanks has become some sort of a hero since this case has become known. There is a petition for his release. Mr. Condalucci's own daughter came out in support of Mr. Fairbanks because she had also been sexually assaulted by her own father, and she was glad that he was now gone and that children are now safe. Mr. Fairbanks also said that he would plead guilty on certain conditions, which is that the Douglas County Attorney's Office reviews the deals that it makes in sex offender cases and that stronger mandatory minimum sentences are established for these types of perpetrators. So essentially, Mr. Fairbanks wants the authorities to stop striking plea deals with these types of criminals, because when you strike a plea deal, basically you get off easy. So it's essentially a way for the prosecution to say, if you make our lives easier, if you make our job easier, then we're going to cut you some slack. Which, especially when it comes to vulnerable victims such as children, it really does make you question the law and the justice system in general, when it's all about convenience and making things easier for the authorities rather than protecting the community. The chief deputy of Douglas County Attorney, Brenda Beadle, said that they wouldn't condition a plea on anything like that. So the position of this chief deputy is that Fairbanks shouldn't have taken the law into his own hands. She specifically said, "I don't classify somebody who would kill somebody in cold blood a hero." So Mr. Fairbanks' main issue is the fact that most of these convicted sex offenders or pedophiles are repeat offenders, because this isn't a light switch that you can just turn on and off. It's a part of their psyche, their mentality. Now, I don't know anything about that. I'm not a mental health expert, and I will not comment on things that I have no knowledge on, but it is very clear from numerous cases that these types of offenders can't help themselves. Now, of course, this is in no way justifying or excusing their actions. No, it's actually justifying putting them away for a long time, because they're just probably, more likely than not, according to the research, going to re-offend over and over. Some of them do try to curb their appetites by isolating themselves or seeking therapy, but again, according to the research, or at least the research I've come across, therapists openly acknowledge that these people can't necessarily be helped. It's just something that has to be kept under control. It can never get better or go away. So Mr. Fairbanks said that if a deal can't be made, which it looks like it can't, he'll take the case to trial in order to raise awareness for his cause. His cause being the complete overhaul of the system and how they deal with sexual offenders, specifically those that target children. Now, normally when I make videos of such a nature, there is a verdict that we can discuss, and then I ask the audience to let me know what their verdict would be. But as I said earlier, this case hasn't even gone to trial yet. So I'm going to ask you now, without the knowledge or the influence of a verdict that has been rendered by a jury, would you convict Mr. Fairbanks of first-degree murder? Or does his claim of self-defense succeed in your eyes? Now, the things to bear in mind here are the elements that we discussed. You must be satisfied that each and every element has been satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt. You must have no doubt in your mind that Mr. Fairbanks deliberately killed Mr. Condalucci with premeditation. So he planned it and set out to do it. If you believe Mr. Fairbanks acted out of self-defense, then you cannot convict him of murder in the first degree. If any of the elements, such as premeditation or purposefulness, fail in your mind, then you cannot convict him of first-degree murder. In my last video, I did give my opinion at the end, and I specifically said, please don't let this taint your opinions. But in the comment section, quite a number of people said, oh, I thought this, but then you gave your opinion, and I know you said not to be tainted by it, but you convinced me. So I don't want to do that again. I really want you to stick to your guns and let me know what you think, which is why I'm not going to let you know what I think. The purpose here is to get a jury of ordinary, everyday people who are not knowledgeable in the law to render their verdict. After all, that's the purpose of the jury system, to ensure that the judicial system or the legal system is not a law unto itself. We need to be kept in check by ordinary members of society, such as yourselves, who are not trained in the legal profession. Because I don't know about the rest of the world, but fun fact, here in Australia, you cannot serve as a member of the jury if you're a lawyer. So with me, for example, I am exempt from jury duty because I'm a lawyer. And I suppose the rationale is we have an unfair advantage. We may be able to sway the rest of the jurors. We are trained in the area. So I suppose it's a way of ensuring that no one has the upper hand and that everyone is on an even keel. That's it for this video. Don't forget to let me know what your verdict is. Please bear in mind the elements, all of them must be satisfied, not just the one. And if you have any doubt, any reasonable doubt in your mind of Mr. Fairbanks' guilt, you cannot render a verdict of guilty. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I'll catch you in a future video. Bye.